Diane Mosley was 40 years old, and for 7 years she had stood in the same driveway every October and waved her husband off on a trip she had never been invited to join. He called it his family visit. He called it a tradition. He said his people in Savannah were old-fashioned and not comfortable with outsiders, and that he needed a few days alone with them every year to stay close to his roots. He said this each October with the particular ease of a man who had said the same thing so many times that he had stopped hearing it himself. Diane would nod and say she understood, and she would watch his car disappear around the bend at the end of Callaway Place, and she would go back inside and spend the next 4 days cooking the house clean and listening to the radio. She had been the kind of wife people described as understanding. She worked as a school librarian. She drove a used Hyundai. She planted irises along the front walk every spring and kept a tidy house and went to church on Sundays without him, because church, too, was something he felt no urgency to share with her. To his colleagues and their social acquaintances, she was Diane. Quiet, pleasant, pleasingly uncomplicated. What none of them knew, what Curtis Mosley had never thought to ask about in 7 years of marriage, was what Diane had been doing with her evenings for the past 2 years, or whose name was on the building permits filed with the county, or why a woman who drove a used Hyundai had a meeting with a commercial insurance broker every quarter. In the 7th October, Diane did not stand in the driveway and wave. She gave Curtis his usual send-off, waited 45 minutes, and then she got in her car and followed the route he always took south toward Georgia. What she found in Savannah was not his family. What she found would take everything Curtis Mosley believed he had been managing and lay it flat on a table in front of people who could not pretend not to see it. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning light that came through the kitchen windows of the house on Callaway Place had always been Diane's favorite hour of the day. It arrived early in October, low and amber, catching the edge of the herb garden she had built against the south-facing wall of the backyard the second summer she and Curtis had lived there. She had laid the cedar border herself, measured the lengths, mitered the corners, sealed the wood against the rain, and planted it with thyme and rosemary and 2 varieties of sage, and every morning she would clip what she needed and come back inside smelling of it. And the kitchen would hold that smell all morning like something that belonged there. It was a small thing. She knew it was a small thing. But her grandfather, Joseph Hale, had been a man who believed that the small things were where a person's true nature lived, and he had raised her on that understanding from the time her mother passed until the time she left for college, and she carried his voice with her the way some people carried photographs. He used to say, whenever she was impatient with something that was taking longer than she thought it should, that the work you did when nobody was watching was the only work that was really yours. He said it about the vegetable garden he kept behind his house in Columbia, South Carolina, the one he tended every morning before the neighborhood woke up, before anyone could arrive to see it and attribute value to what he was growing. He wanted to grow things for the growing of them. He wanted to know what was his. She had thought about that sentence a great deal over the past 2 years. She had met Curtis at a book fair when she was 32. One of those pleasant community events where people browse tables of secondhand paperbacks and feel briefly connected to the better versions of themselves they intend to become. He had picked up the same book she was reaching for, and he had laughed at the coincidence with a warmth that seemed entirely natural, and they had gone for coffee afterward and talked for 3 hours. He was a mid-level manager at a logistics company. He was attentive and funny in a measured way, and he asked about her work at the library with genuine interest, and she had thought, on the drive home that evening, that she had met someone who understood the value of quiet things. They were married inside 2 years. The early seasons of their marriage were easy and warm, and if his family in Savannah had always been a slight distance, a group of relatives she had spoken to on the phone but never met, whose gathering each October remained a fixed and unquestioned fixture on his calendar. She had told herself that every family had its particular customs, and that patience was a form of respect. By the 5th year, the question of the October trip had settled into the furniture of their life together. By the 6th, she had noticed that he was slightly different when he returned. Not dishonest exactly, but recalibrated, as though he had spent 4 days being a version of himself that the version she lived with needed a day or two to replace. She had noted it without naming it. She was a librarian. She had learned long ago that you understood a text better if you let it finish before you began to interpret it. The incoming signal arrived 2 months before the 7th October in the form of a charge on the shared credit card statement for a florist in Savannah. The amount was $87. The date was a Tuesday in August, a month she had spent entirely in Virginia with her sister following a minor medical procedure, and which Curtis had spent, as far as she knew, at home. She had looked at the charge for a long time. Then she had taken a photograph of the statement and put the phone in the kitchen drawer beneath the dish towels. She did not say anything. She needed to know the shape of what she was looking at. She left 2 hours after his car turned the corner. She had mapped the route the previous evening using a road atlas she had pulled from the library's reference section, an old habit her grandfather had given her, the habit of working from paper when you wanted to think clearly. Curtis had always taken I-26 south to I-95 and then down to Savannah. She knew this because, in the 2nd year of the October trips, she had noticed his car's mileage when he left and when he returned, and the numbers matched that corridor exactly. She had not been looking for evidence then. She had simply been paying attention, the way she always had. She drove south with the radio off, which was how she thought best, and arrived in Savannah by late afternoon on a Thursday. She did not know the address of his family's home. She had never been given one, and in 7 years had never felt the absence of that information the way she felt it now. Driving the quiet residential streets of a city she had never been brought to, looking for the shape of a life she had not been permitted to see. What she had was the name of the neighborhood he had mentioned once. In passing, in the 2nd year of the October trips, Ardsley Park, and the florist's name from the credit card statement. She found the florist on a commercial street off Bull Street, a small shop with window boxes full of late-season mums and a hand-lettered sign in the glass, and she went inside and asked, as quietly and directly as she could manage, whether they had standing delivery accounts for addresses in the residential areas to the west. The woman behind the counter was in her 60s, the kind of woman who operated a neighborhood business for decades because she loved the neighborhood, not the business, and who remembered the people she served the way librarians remembered their regular patrons. When Diane described the arrangement style, fresh flowers, mixed seasonals, changed twice a month, and mentioned the general area, the woman nodded with immediate recognition. "Mrs. Whitfield's standing order," she said. "She's been with us for years. Sometimes her husband brings the order in himself, rather than waiting for delivery." She paused, and in the pause was the awareness of a woman who knew more than she was going to say unprompted. Tall man. Always pays in cash. Diane thanked her warmly and walked out. She drove 2 blocks south and pulled to the curb on a tree-lined residential street and sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the dashboard. Her face was perfectly calm. It had been calm since the parking lot of the motel, where she had made the decision to follow him. That kind of calm was not detachment. It was the particular clarity that arrived when a person stopped wondering and started finding out. She found the address at the main branch of the Chatham County Library, 2 miles east, where the county property records were publicly accessible on terminals available to anyone who walked through the door. She drove there and sat at a terminal and worked through the records with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had spent 20 years directing people to the right information through the right systems. Within 30 minutes, she had a name, an address, a deed history, and a linked insurance filing pulled from the adjacent county records database. The property on Whitmore Lane was registered to a woman named Angela Whitfield. It had been purchased 8 years ago, 1 year before Diane met Curtis at the book fair. The deed of sale showed no co-buyer. The mortgage had been paid off 4 years ago in a lump sum payment that the transaction records noted without explanation. The household insurance policy connected to the property listed 2 residents. One of them was Curtis Antoine Mosley. He had been listed as a resident at that address for 6 of the 7 years they had been married. He had, in the 2nd year of their marriage, the same year he had introduced the October trips as a fixed tradition, begun carrying a second residential life in this city, in this house, with this woman, and had maintained it with a consistency and care that he had never applied to the joint checking account or the gutters on the house on Calloway Place. She moved with the same deliberate calm that had always defined her. She photographed every screen with her phone. She printed the documents the library's printer would produce. She put everything in the manila folder she had brought from home. She had brought it because her grandfather had taught her that you prepared your materials before you needed them, not after. And because she had understood, when she left the house that morning, that she was going to find something that required a place to be kept. She did not drive to Whitmore Lane. She already had what she needed. She checked into a motel off Abercorn Street, ordered food from a diner 3 blocks away, and spent the evening at the small desk in the room with her printed records and a yellow legal pad, writing down what she knew and what could be documented and what she still needed. She was methodical about it. She had always been methodical. Order was not a comfort to her the way it was to some people. It was simply the way she thought, the way her grandfather had thought, the way people thought when they understood that problems were addressed one accurate step at a time. She made a single call before she went to sleep. She called her father's oldest sister, her Aunt Vera in Colombia, who was 73 and had known 3 husbands and outlasted all of them with grace, and who had the particular quality of a woman who had seen most things and was neither surprised nor undone by any of them. "Vera," she said, "I found something. I need a name." Vera gave her 2. Preparation, Diane thought as she set the legal pad aside, was the only honest form of courage. She drove home Friday morning through the same corridor she had come down 2 days earlier, and the miles unrolled in reverse, and she drove them in the same silence she had maintained on the way south. Because silence was how she thought most clearly, and because there was a great deal to think through. She had what she needed. Now she needed to understand the complete shape of what she had. Curtis returned on Sunday evening. He came in through the side door with his travel bag and the settled ease of a man who had spent 4 days somewhere that agreed with him. And she had dinner on the table and the kitchen smelling of rosemary from the herb garden. And she asked how his family was holding up. He said it had been a good visit. He said his Aunt Lena sent her regards, a name he had used for 7 years, a woman Diane had never met or spoken to, a fixture in the story he told about where he went in October. She passed him the bread and asked whether his Aunt Lena's hip was feeling better, because she had asked about the hip 2 years ago, and she wanted to see whether the story still carried its original details. He said she was doing much better. Thank you for asking. She nodded and cleared the first course and went back to the stove. The folder was in the second drawer of the filing cabinet in the spare bedroom, inside a plain manila sleeve with nothing written on the outside. She had 6 weeks, she calculated, to do this completely and correctly. She said nothing else about Savannah. The work you did when nobody was watching was the only work that was really yours, and she was not finished yet. The attorney Vera had sent her to was a woman named Patricia Osei, based in Colombia, who handled family law and fraud cases, and who had, according to Vera, once recovered a hidden account from a man who had been concealing it for 9 years. Patricia was direct and unhurried, and she asked questions that moved in a straight line. When Diane had finished laying out everything she had brought, the property records, the insurance filing, the credit card statements, the deed history from Chatham County, Patricia looked at the documents for a long time without speaking. "He has been listed as a resident at that address for 6 years," she said. "Correct. While married to you." "Correct, and the property is in another woman's name." "It is. Angela Whitfield. I have not contacted her." Patricia nodded. "Don't. Not yet." She picked up the insurance document and studied the household filing. "This shows him as a co-resident. That has legal implications for his insurance obligations, his financial disclosures, potentially his tax filings if he has been claiming any household deductions." She set it down. "We are going to need a forensic accountant to look at 7 years of joint and individual filings. We are also going to need a private investigator to document the Savannah residence with current photographs, because what you have here is excellent groundwork, but a court needs corroboration that is current and professionally obtained." She looked at Diane steadily. "I want you to understand what you have brought me. This is not a suspicion. This is a documented pattern. What comes next is a matter of how thoroughly we want to build it." Diane looked back at her with the same steadiness. "My grandfather used to tell me that the work you do when nobody is watching is the only work that is really yours." She paused. "I have been watching for 2 years. I would like to build it completely." Patricia nodded once. "Then let's begin." The investigator Patricia retained was a man named Davis, who worked quietly and produced a file within 10 days that included dated photographs, a documented schedule of Curtis's arrivals and departures at the Whitmore Lane address over 3 visits across 4 months, and a public records pull that showed Curtis had, in the 5th year of their marriage, added his name to the utility accounts at the Savannah address. The forensic accountant found, in 7 years of joint tax returns, 4 years in which a secondary address deduction had been quietly included under a business travel category that Patricia's accountant identified as non-qualifying and potentially fraudulent. The full picture, assembled and documented and organized into the kind of clean, accurate record that could withstand scrutiny, was ready in 6 weeks. Diane called her sister in Virginia to tell her what was coming. Her sister said she would drive down. Her Aunt Vera said she already knew and would be there. She had not told Curtis anything. She had simply, for 6 weeks, continued to be Diane. The herb garden, the library, the Sunday mornings, the dinners. She had passed the bread and asked about his day, and listened to him describe a life in which she was the uncomplicated constant he returned to between the chapters he had written elsewhere. Some walls, she had come to understand, looked like walls until the moment you knew where the door had always been. The mediation meeting was held at Patricia's office on a Thursday morning in December, 2 weeks before the holidays, in a room with pale light coming through high windows and a rectangular table that seated 6. Curtis arrived with his attorney, a man from a general practice firm who had prepared a standard community property response, and found himself seated across from Patricia, a forensic accountant named Mr. Gerald Webb, Diane's Aunt Vera, who had driven 2 hours and was wearing her best gray coat, and Diane herself, who had arrived early and was already seated with her hands folded on the table in front of her. He had not expected Vera. Patricia opened the folder without ceremony. The Chatham County property records. the utility account in Curtis's name, the insurance filing listing him as a resident, the investigators' dated photographs, the 4 years of tax return discrepancies identified by Mr. Webb, with the relevant lines highlighted in yellow. She laid them out one at a time, the way a person laid cards on a table when they were not playing a game but simply showing what they held. Curtis's attorney leaned over. Curtis sat very still. "Mr. Mosley," Patricia said, "we are prepared to document, for the court, a 7-year pattern of material misrepresentation in the context of a legal marriage, including the maintenance of a secondary household, fraudulent financial disclosures, and potentially actionable misrepresentations on joint tax filings." She paused. "We are offering this mediation because my client prefers to resolve this efficiently. That preference has limits." Curtis looked at Diane. He tried to find, in her face, the version of her he knew, the patient one, the understanding one, the one who had waved from the driveway every October and asked no questions. She looked back at him with the same expression she had always had, and he understood, in the particular way that people understood things that could not be undone, that those two things had always been the same woman. He tried. He said there were things she did not understand about the situation. He said it had been complicated. He said he had meant to tell her, that he had been trying to find the right time. His attorney put a pen on the table in front of him, and Curtis went quiet. Vera spoke from her chair at the end of the table. She did not raise her voice. She said, in the way of a woman who had been a witness to the full span of a person's life and was not going to allow it to be minimized, "My niece drove to Savannah and found your other house. She found it. She documented it. She came home. She made your dinner. And she spent 6 weeks building what is in that folder. What you meant to do is not relevant to this table." The room was very still after that. Diane stood. She straightened her jacket, the good one, the one she wore to things that mattered. She picked up her copy of the folder and held it for a moment before she placed it, neatly, at the center of the table. "You called it a family visit," she said. Her voice was even and unhurried. "I want you to know that I understand now why you needed to go alone." She looked at him with the full attention of a woman who had spent 7 years seeing exactly as much as she had been shown, and 2 years seeing the rest. "The work you do when nobody is watching is the only work that is really yours. My grandfather told me that. I think about it often." She picked up her bag and walked to the door. Vera rose and followed her, without looking back. 9 months later, the irises along the front walk of a different house, a craftsman bungalow on Mercer Street in Columbia, 2 blocks from her Aunt Vera and 4 blocks from the library branch where she had accepted a position as head of collections, had come up thick and violet in the spring soil. Diane had dug and divided the original bulbs herself, wrapped them in newspaper, and carried them from Calloway Place the day she finished the move, because they were hers, and she had planted them, and they were coming with her. The bungalow had a screened back porch she was restoring board by board on weekends. She had refinished the porch floor herself over 3 Saturdays in March, working in long strips from the far end toward the door, the way her grandfather had taught her to work a wood floor so you never painted yourself into a corner. The grain had come up clean under the sander. She had sealed it with 2 coats and let it cure in the spring air, and had sat in her camp chair at the edge of it on a Sunday evening and been entirely satisfied with what she had done. A man named Samuel Cole had moved next door in February, a quiet, deliberate man who was a high school history teacher and who had introduced himself by returning her mail, which the post office had confused with his for 3 days running. He had knocked on the door at a decent hour and handed over the envelopes one by one and mentioned, without being asked, that he had noticed she was refinishing the porch, and that he had done the same thing 2 summers ago, and the Minwax oil-based formula held up better than the water based in the Carolina humidity. She had thanked him and used the formula he recommended, and it had performed exactly as he said. She found she liked a person who gave useful information, and then let you use it in peace. The news about Curtis had come through Vera, who had heard it from a cousin in Savannah. He had left the logistics company, not voluntarily, following an internal audit that had surfaced the expense irregularities the forensic accountant had identified in his filings. Angela Whitfield had ended things and relocated to Atlanta. Curtis had moved in with his brother in Augusta and was, by last account, selling insurance from a small agency on the edge of town. His mother had not spoken to him since Vera had called her in December and told her, plainly and completely, what her son had been doing. The social cost was total. Diane had not counted it. She had simply been informed of it and set it aside. The irises on Mercer Street were the best they had ever looked. She cut 3 of them on a Tuesday morning and put them in a jar on the kitchen windowsill, and the light came through the jar and threw long violet shapes across the counter, and she stood there with her coffee and let herself be fully present in the life she had built when no one was watching. That was the only work that was really hers. She had always known it. She knew it better now. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.